Most folks in the frontier towns had heard strange offers before, but nothing quite like the one that echoed across the dusty yard of Iron Bend mine that morning. The wind carried every word, making sure even the men unloading or wagons froze mid-motion. The boss of the mine, a wide-shouldered man named Braddock Thorne, stood on the steps of his office and glared at the tall Apache warrior in front of him. The silence was so sharp a horse snorted just to break it. "Marry my daughter or ride out for good," Braddock said, his boots planted firm in the dirt. "Those are your choices." The workers stared, some pretending they weren't listening, others too stunned to move. No one expected a demand like that. And the Apache, known around Iron Bend as Talon Gray, didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his knife. He didn't turn to leave. He just stood still with the strength of a man who had seen worse than morning threats. Talon had been working at the mine for months, hauling heavy stone, clearing blocked shafts, doing the hardest jobs without complaint. Folks respected him, even if they never said it loud. He was steady, quiet, the kind of man who didn't waste words and didn't show fear. That made the boss challenge feel even stranger. Everyone knew Braddock had a daughter he kept hidden. Rumors followed her name down the saloons and store aisles. Some said she was born wrong. Some said she was scarred. Others whispered she was cursed, marked by the mountain spirits. No one had ever seen her face, and that only fed the talk. All they knew was that Braddock protected her like a wolf guarding a wounded cub. But no one expected he'd try to force an Apache into marriage. Talon's dark eyes didn't shift. "Why me?" he asked, his voice low, steady enough to quiet the entire yard. Braddock crossed his arms. "Because you're the only man around here who ain't chasing gold or gossip. You work honest. You don't run your mouth. And you don't fear me." Then Braddock's voice tightened. "My daughter deserves someone who won't mock her." Some of the men looked down, ashamed of the rumors they themselves had repeated. Others waited for Talon to reject the offer and walk off. But the Apache didn't move. He stood tall beneath the rising sun, his shadow long on the dirt. "I will see her first," Talon said. Braddock nodded once, sharp. "She wears a veil." His jaw tightened. "She won't remove it until you agree." That made the whispering start again. A veil, hidden face, hidden truth. Whatever Braddock's daughter looked like, the boss believed it needed covering. And Talon was being asked to accept her before knowing the truth. Talon's expression didn't change. "If she is willing, then I will speak with her." Braddock stared hard at him, maybe surprised he didn't shout or laugh or spit in the dirt. Instead, the Apache warrior stood calm, giving the offer the kind of respect no one else would have. "Fine," Braddock said. "You come to the house this evening." With that, the boss turned and walked inside, leaving the yard frozen behind him. The workers began moving again, but the mood had changed. They watched Talon like he might explode or ride off or fight someone. But he didn't. He just picked up the heavy crate he had been carrying before the conversation and continued working. Later that day, as Talon finished his shift, a ranch hand named Buck Ryland approached him. Buck was one of the few who spoke to Talon without judgment. "You ain't really considering his offer, are you?" Buck asked, scratching the back of his neck. Talon shrugged. "A man should hear the truth from the person it concerns." Buck looked toward the big house at the edge of the mine's land. "They say she ain't right," he whispered. "They say she's strange. They say many things," Talon replied. Buck sighed. "You're braver than me." He paused, then added, "Just be careful. Braddock ain't a man who forgives a change of mind." Talon didn't answer. With the sun slipping behind the ridge, he saddled his horse and rode toward the boss home. The trail was quiet, the kind that made a man listen to his own thoughts. He wondered who the young woman was, what she feared, what story she carried behind that veil. When he reached the house, Braddock stood on the porch with a lantern. "Inside," he said. Talon stepped through the door into a room that smelled of pine, dust, and old secrets. The boss led him to a small parlor lit by 2 oil lamps. In the corner stood a young woman dressed in a pale gown, her hands clasped tight at her waist. A long white veil covered her face from forehead to chin. She stood stiff, as if afraid to breathe too deeply. "This is my daughter, Liren," Braddock said. Talon bowed his head slightly in greeting. She shifted, startled by the gesture. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and nervous. You are the Apache who works at the mine. Yes, Talon answered. Your father says you need a husband. I want to know if this is your choice. Liren hesitated. Her gloved fingers twisted together. I do not wish to be alone anymore, she said. But men, they do not want someone like me. Talon didn't look away. I do not judge by rumor. Her breath caught. Then you are the first. Braddock folded his arms, watching closely. You agree to marry her, Talon Gray, and you'll stay here under my protection. Say no, and you leave Iron Bend tonight? Talon turned toward the young woman. If I agree, will you remove the veil? He asked. Liren froze. Her shoulders shook. I cannot, she whispered. Not until the promise is made. Father says men need to commit before they see me. Talon studied her posture, her trembling hands, the fear she tried to hide. He could sense there was more to this than Braddock admitted. Something unspoken. Something heavy. Why hide your face? Talon asked gently. Liren's breath wavered. Because men have run before, she said. Because I am not what people expect. Because no one stays. Her words carried a pain deeper than gossip. Braddock stepped forward. So, he said. Will you take her hand or not? Talon remained silent. The lamps flickered. Outside, wind pressed against the windows. Liren kept her head lowered as if bracing for rejection. Then Talon said, If she wishes it, I will agree. Liren gasped softly, and Braddock exhaled as if a weight lifted. But before the boss could celebrate, Talon added, When the veil comes off, I decide what happens next. Braddock frowned. You already agreed. I agreed to meet her, Talon said. Not to blind myself? Braddock opened his mouth to argue, but Liren whispered, Father, let him see. The room shifted. Braddock looked torn between anger and surrender. Finally, he nodded L-wire and reached up with shaking fingers. Talon watched carefully, sensing the depth of her fear. As her hands touched the edge of the veil, the lamps flickered again. Throwing long shadows onto the walls, the cloth lifted slowly, just as the fabric began to fall away. A loud bang rattled the windows, and someone shouted from outside. Hoofs thundered on the dirt road. Braddock cursed under his breath. Talon stepped forward. Hand instinctively moving toward his belt, Liren froze halfway. The veil still lifting, her eyes wide behind the cloth, the front door flew open. And a frantic rider yelled, Braddock, they're here. Talon turned sharply. Who was here? And why now, on the very night the veil was coming off? The truth waited inches away. But danger had arrived before he could see her face. The rider's warning hung in the air like smoke from a blown-out lamp. Talon didn't know who the man was talking about, but the fear in his voice was real. Braddock Thorne stormed toward the porch without another word, the floorboards shaking beneath his boots. Talon followed, keeping one eye on Liren, who stood frozen with her veil half lifted, hands trembling as if the danger outside was tied to her in some way. Outside. The horses were restless, stamping the ground and tossing their heads. The rider who had burst in was still breathing hard, pointing toward the road that wound down the ridge. Braddock, they rode past the mine, he said. Didn't stop. Didn't speak. Just headed straight this way? Braddock swore, looking toward the darkening trail. How many? 4, maybe 5, the rider said. Hard to tell in the light. Talon moved onto the porch, his eyes narrowing toward the ridge. He could see the faint silhouette of riders at a distance, moving in a tight, deliberate line. Not wandering men. Not travelers. Men with purpose. Who are they? Talon asked. Braddock didn't answer at first. His face stiffened as if the truth was something he didn't want to say out loud. The rider answered instead. It's the Cade brothers. The name hit heavier than a dropped hammer. Even Talon recognized it. The Cade brothers were troublemakers known across the frontier. Men who worked half in the daylight, half in the shadows. Some called them ranchers. Others called them thieves. Most called them dangerous. Talon stepped down from the porch. Why would they ride here? Braddock ran a hand across his jaw, that same tightness returning to his voice. Because they want something they think is theirs. Talon felt a shift in the air. The tension wasn't coming from strangers marching into town. It was inside this house, inside this story, tied to the very reason he had been called here tonight. I should move Liren to safety, Braddock said, glancing back at the door. She can't be seen by them. Not now. Talon paused. What do they want with her? Braddock didn't meet his eyes. That's not your concern. It is if I stand in front of your door against armed men, Talon replied. Braddock stopped. His silence carried a buried truth, something he'd worked hard to keep hidden. The rider looked uneasy, shifting on his heels. Far in the distance, the riders grew clearer, their horses pushing through the dusk. Braddock let out a low breath. The Cade brothers think my daughter belongs to them, he said. Talon stiffened. Why? Because her mother was promised to their family long before she ever married me? Braddock said quietly. An old deal. An arrangement made without love. Her mother ran from it, and they never forgave that. His voice hardened. Now they want to claim the daughter instead. As payment. Talon's jaw tensed. The workers' rumors suddenly seemed small compared to this truth. Folks whispered about Liren's face, her veil, her strangeness. But no one knew the real danger that had been chasing her since birth. And you think forcing her into marriage with me will stop them? Talon said. Braddock's voice grew firm. A husband changes her standing. A husband gives her protection. The Cades won't cross a bonded household. It's one of their own rules. They follow their own code. He pointed at Talon. And you're the only one I trust to stand between her and them. The wind carried the rising hoofbeats. The riders were coming fast. Talon looked back toward the house. Liren still stood near the door, her veil shading her face, her posture caught between fear and strength. She wasn't a problem Braddock wanted to hide. She was a promise he was desperate to protect. He turned back toward the trail. Get her inside, Talon said. I will hold them at the front. Braddock hesitated. You don't owe us a thing, Talon. You can still leave. No, Talon said. If the danger comes to this house, I face it. Braddock swallowed hard and nodded once. Inside, Liren watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. She had lowered the veil back over her face, covering whatever truth Talon had almost seen. Are they coming for me? She whispered. Talon didn't lie. Yes, she stepped back, her breath sharp. Then you should go. They won't follow you. Talon shook his head. I do not run from men who hunt the helpless. Liren's voice cracked. You don't even know who I am. That does not change the danger, he said. Outside, hoofs thundered closer. Braddock stepped between them. Liren, go to the back room. Don't come out. She hesitated, looking once more at Talon as if trying to understand why someone who owed her nothing would stay. Then she stepped down the hallway and disappeared behind a door. Braddock closed it and faced the porch again. Talon moved to the yard, planting himself firmly in front of the house. The dirt was dry under his boots. The lamps inside glowed faintly behind him. He felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like the cold of a mountain morning. The Cade brothers rode into view. 5 of them. Thick-bearded men with cold eyes and long coats. Their leader, Flint Cade, had a scar cutting across his forehead, a reminder of a life lived half wild. He reined his horse hard and glared at the man standing in front of Braddock's home. Move aside, Flint said. We're here for what belongs to us. Nothing here belongs to you, Talon answered. The brothers shifted in their saddles. Surprised an Apache stood blocking their path without fear. Flint raised a brow. This your place? He asked. No. Then you're standing in a fight that ain't yours. Talon didn't blink. I stand where I choose? Flint smirked. Braddock hiding the girl inside. His voice changed, dropping a colder note. We'll take her now. Talon stepped forward. You will not. One of the brothers leaned close to Flint. Why is he protecting her? Flint glared harder. Because he's a hired hand who thinks too much of himself. Talon didn't answer. He didn't reach for a weapon, but his stance told the brothers enough. He wasn't moving. Flint nudged his horse forward. Last warning, Apache, move. Talon took a slow breath. If you come closer, you cross me first? The silence between them tightened. The brothers exchanged looks. They weren't used to being challenged. No one stood against them without backup. No one blocked their path alone. Inside the house, Braddock held his breath behind the window curtain. Liren pressed her hands together in the dark room, listening to every word, fear wrapping around her like cold cloth. She had lived her whole life knowing the Cades would come someday. But she didn't expect an Apache warrior she had just met to stand in their way. Flint finally lifted his chin. Tell Braddock we'll be back, he said. And next time we don't ask. The brothers turned their horses sharply, dust kicking up into the fading light. They rode off toward the ridge, leaving a trail of tension behind them. Talon waited until the sound of hooves faded before he stepped back toward the porch. Braddock pushed the door open, shoulders slumped with a mix of relief and dread. This isn't over, Braddock said. They'll return. And when they do, they'll bring more men. Talon nodded. I know. Braddock looked at him with a heavy expression. You didn't have to stay. Talon looked toward the back room door where Liren had disappeared. She didn't choose her past. No one should be hunted for it. Braddock let out a long breath. She's safer with you than with any man I know. His voice softened a little. But there's more to this than the Cades, more than the past. Things I haven't told you yet. Talon stared at him. Then tell me now. Braddock shook his head. Not here. Not where she can hear. He motioned toward the kitchen. There's something about the veil. Something about her mother. You need to know it before you make any promise. Talon followed him in silence. The lamps flickered against the wooden walls, their shadows moving like restless spirits. Braddock poured water into 2 tin cups, hands shaking more than he wanted to admit. Talon, he said, before you decide anything, you must understand who Liren really is. The Apache warrior leaned forward. The truth was finally coming, but just as Braddock opened his mouth to speak, a sharp knock hit the door, hard, urgent. Not the Cade brothers. Someone else had arrived, someone with their own claim in this unfolding story, and whatever they brought with them. It was tied to Liren too. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the thin wood of the front door. Braddock's words died in his throat. The secret about Liren, the veil, her mother, all of it slipped back behind his eyes. Talon rose from his chair in one smooth motion. I'll open it, Talon said. Braddock hesitated, then nodded. If it's the Cades, don't let them inside. Talon moved through the front room, past the closed hallway door where Liren waited in silence. He could feel her presence on the other side like a heartbeat hidden behind the boards. When he reached the entrance, he paused, listening. Whoever stood on the other side wasn't trying to hide. Boots shifted. A horse snorted. One person? Not many. Talon pulled the door open. Sheriff Calder Pike stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and a grim line set into his weathered face. He was a man who had seen his share of gunsmoke and bad choices, and the way he gripped the brim of his hat said he carried more than news. Talon, Calder said. Figured I'd find you here. Talon stepped aside. Sheriff. Braddock came from the kitchen, his shoulders stiff. If you're here to tell me to hand my daughter over, save your breath. Calder shook his head. If that was my plan, I wouldn't have ridden alone. He stepped inside, glancing toward the window, making sure no one had followed. Cades are stirring up trouble in town. Thought you should know what they're saying. Braddock's jaw clenched. Go on. Calder set his hat down and rubbed his temples. They're telling anyone who'll listen that you're hiding what belongs to them. They spread word that your girl was promised before she was even born. They're waving old papers. Talon, say there's a contract with your late wife's family name on it. The kind that makes men think they have the right to take a person. Talon's eyes narrowed. And what does the town think? Calder sighed. Some folks side with whoever holds the most guns. Some side with whoever signs their wage papers. Some just want their own doors left alone. He glanced at Talon. But they're wondering why an Apache is standing guard at this house. The Cades are calling it proof that Braddock's lost his mind. Braddock slammed his hand on the table. If they think that they haven't seen what I'll do to keep her safe. Calder looked tired. That kind of talk might bring more trouble than you can handle. Talon spoke quietly. They said they would come back with more men. Calder nodded. They've already started. I counted at least 8 riders around their camp. By morning there'll be more. Men who owe them favors. Men who like the idea of riding under a feared name. He paused. They don't just want to frighten you. They want to make a point. In the back room, Liren leaned against the door, listening to every muffled word. She had grown up hearing the Cade name whispered like a bad omen. She knew about the contract her mother had refused. She knew about the night her mother fled to Braddock instead of accepting a loveless life. But hearing that the Cades held actual papers, that they were waving them in town, made her stomach twist. She pressed a hand to the veil over her face. Her reflection in the small mirror beside the bed was just a white blur. She could not see what others saw. She had never stared long at herself. The veil had been part of her since she was young, a shield her father insisted on. For your protection, he used to say. But sometimes it felt more like a wall. Now an Apache warrior stood between her and the men who wanted to claim her like property. She did not understand why, but she felt the weight of it. She stepped away from the door and moved to the window in her room. From there she could see a slice of the yard. Talon's horse. Calder's horse. The outline of Talon's shoulders through the glass, strong and still. Her heart beat faster. She had barely spoken to him, yet he had blocked the path of 5 armed men without a second thought. In the front room, Calder lowered his voice. Braddock, talk in town says you're forcing your daughter to marry in a hurry. That you're making her take a husband she didn't choose? Braddock stiffened. I'm trying to keep her alive. Calder held up a hand. I know. But the way folks tell it, you're bargaining her out like land. That gives the Cades more fuel. Makes it sound like she's a prize in a dispute, not a person. Talon's gaze hardened. She is not a prize. Calder looked at him. Then you understand what I'm saying. This can't just be about deals between men. It has to be about what she wants. Otherwise, the whole town will treat her like a pulled rope in a fight they can't see clearly. Braddock sank into a chair. His face, which always looked carved from stone, showed cracks. You think I don't know that? He said. You think I haven't watched her struggle just to step out on the porch? His voice grew rough. They tormented her mother before she died. Called her cursed. Called her wrong for running from them. I won't let them do the same to Liren. Talon leaned forward. You said there was more to her story. About the veil. About her mother. Calder glanced between them. If I'm not meant to hear this part, say so. Braddock shook his head slowly. You may as well. You've seen enough of this town's ugliness. The sheriff stayed where he was silent. Braddock took a deep breath, the kind a man takes before ripping open an old wound. Liren's mother was born into a family that believed in deals over love. They promised her to the Cades to secure grazing rights and trade lines. She never wanted it. She said she felt wrong every time she thought about standing next to them as a wife. Then she met me when I first came to Iron Bend, before the mine, before all this land. He looked toward the hallway. She chose me instead. Talon watched him. And the Cades never forgave that choice. Braddock nodded. They said she made them fools. When Liren was born, the midwife told us she had markings on her face. A birth sign. Something like a pale streak near her eye and a small scar-like line across her cheek, though nothing had hurt her. Just the way she came into this world. His voice grew softer. I thought she was perfect. Her mother did too. Calder folded his arms. But the town didn't. Braddock's mouth twisted. Word spread. People said she was marked because her mother broke the contract. Said the Cade's curse sat on that child's face. He looked at Talon. I put the veil on her when she was still small. At first to stop gossip. Then to keep people from staring. Then it became habit. A shield that turned into a prison. Talon's chest tightened. This was more than a veil hiding ugliness. It was hiding the town's cruelty, protecting a child from the narrow eyes of people who needed easy targets. So the Cades want to claim her, use her, and prove their power, Talon said. And the town wants to decide her worth by what they see on her face. Braddock nodded. That is why I want her married to a man who doesn't care about either. Calder studied Talon, and that is where you come in. You're outside their lines? Neither Cade nor town. But that also paints a mark on your back. Talon knew that. He had felt that mark since the day he first rode into Iron Bend. To many settlers he was an outsider. Useful when he carried weight and kept his eyes low. Dangerous when he stood tall and spoke. Do you ask for my help as a boss or as a father? Talon asked quietly. Braddock's voice dropped. As a father. Calder shifted, uncomfortable with the gravity in the room. If you stand with them, Talon, it won't just be the Cades you face. Some men in this town don't like an Apache claiming any kind of place here. They'll call it a challenge to their order. Talon thought of his own people. Of camps broken apart, of long rides across dry land, of promises made and then shattered by men who wore uniforms and shook hands with one face while planning with another. He had left a lot behind to carve some small peace for himself. He had not planned to tie his fate to a veiled woman and her haunted father, yet he could not ignore the fire in his chest when he saw how they were being hunted in the back room. Liren pressed her forehead against the window pane. She thought of the Cade brothers, of the way people in town looked away when she passed by with her veil and her careful steps. She remembered standing behind her mother's skirts as a child, hearing the taunts, the ugly words, the quiet threats. She remembered the night her mother clutched her close and whispered that she was not a curse, that no mark on her skin could erase the light in her. Her mother was buried on the hill behind the house now, under a twisted pine. Sometimes Liren went there at dawn when the sky was still soft and gray, lifting her veil only enough to feel the cool air on her skin where no one could see. She had always thought she would live and die hidden. Her life decided by choices made before she was born. Now an Apache warrior stood in the middle of her story, changing its shape without even knowing her face. Back in the main room, Calder broke the silence. You've got a few paths ahead, he said. You can run. Load your wagons, take your daughter, and disappear before dawn. The Cades will chase you a while, then find some new way to throw their weight around. He paused. You can give in, hand her over, and live with that choice forever. His eyes hardened. Or you can stand here and fight. But if you do, you'd better be ready for what that means. Blood, maybe. Broken fences. A town forced to take sides. Braddock stared at the floor. He had built his life on this land, dug wealth out of the dark stone, hired men, paid wages, carved his name into this corner of the frontier. But all of it meant little against the thought of his daughter being taken. I won't hand her over, he said. Calder nodded as if he had expected that. Then you'd better decide fast how to protect her? Because the Cades don't wait long once they've set their mind. He put his hat back on. As he reached for the door, he spoke to Talon. There's one more thing. Cades told folks they're willing to pay any man who stands aside and lets them walk through. He held Talon's gaze. That means they believe you can be bought. They're counting on fear. Talon's voice was steady. They misjudge me. Calder gave a short nod. I figured as much. He stepped outside. I'll stall them as best I can. But I can't promise how long that will work. When the sheriff rode away into the night, the house sank into a heavy quiet. Braddock moved to the hallway and opened Liren's door. She stepped out, veil in place, hands clasped. You heard? He said. Most of it. She answered softly. Talon stood in the doorway between the front room and the hall. The distance between them felt thin and thick at the same time. Liren lifted her chin, even though her eyes were hidden. I don't want to be taken, she said. I don't want to belong to the Cades, but I also don't want to be a burden that ruins your life or his. Her voice trembled on the last word. Talon stepped closer, stopping a respectful distance away. You are not a burden, he said. You are a person being hunted? That is the burden. Not you. She swallowed hard. If you stand with us, will your own people suffer for it? Will this town turn on you? Maybe, Talon said honestly. But my life means little if I use it only to protect myself. Braddock watched them both, conflict etched into his features. He saw the way his daughter leaned slightly toward Talon's voice, as if drawn by something solid in it. He saw the way Talon regarded her, not with pity, but with a kind of measured respect. Talon, Braddock said slowly, I asked you before as a father. Now I ask you as a man to another man. Will you stay? Will you help me stand against them? The Apache warrior looked at the father, then at the veiled figure of the daughter whose face he still had not seen outside. In the dark beyond the lamplight, a dog barked in the distance. Somewhere in town, the Cade brothers were rolling out maps, lining up allies, planning their next move. Every passing minute tightened the rope around this quiet house. Talon drew a breath, feeling every choice he had ever made lined up behind this moment. If he said yes, he stepped into a storm that might never fully pass. If he said no, he walked away and left a hunted woman to face men who believed they owned her fate. The room seemed to hold its breath. Waiting for his answer, Talon stood there in the silence, the weight of every choice pressing on his shoulders like a winter sky. Liren didn't move, didn't speak. Braddock waited with a tight jaw, his hands curled as if he was bracing for whatever answer came next. Outside, the night was still, too still, like the land itself was watching. Finally, Talon spoke. I will stay. The words settled into the house like a stone dropped into deep water. Liren's breath shook. Braddock let out a long exhale, the kind that came from a man who had been holding fear inside for too long. But Talon didn't give them time to thank him. He moved toward the front door, checking the latch, scanning the yard through the window. The Cades will return by morning, Talon said. Maybe sooner. Braddock nodded. Then we prepare tonight. Liren stepped forward, her hands twisting together under the veil. They want me, she whispered. Not this house? Not the land. Just me. Talon looked at her, the lamps reflecting off the thin veil that hid everything except the outline of her face. Then we protect you. She hesitated, then asked in a trembling voice, even if they bring enough men to tear this place down. Talon didn't answer with a big speech. He simply said yes. Braddock placed a hand on her shoulder and guided her toward her room. You should rest. But Liren shook her head. I'll help. This is my fight too. Braddock's eyes tightened, but Talon nodded. Let her stay, he said. Fear grows in the dark. Light makes people braver. Liren stood a little straighter at his words. The three of them spent the next hour closing shutters, moving furniture and checking the edges of the yard for places someone could slip through. Talon walked the property line, reading the ground like a man who'd lived his life in open country. He saw tracks from the Cade riders, saw where they'd stopped just out of sight earlier that day, heard where the dogs in nearby homesteads barked at something unseen. They were closer than Braddock thought. When Talon came back inside. Braddock was lighting a second lantern and Liren stood beside him, holding a small wooden box. She opened it and lifted out a faded band of cloth, worn thin but well cared for. This belonged to my mother, she said softly. She used it to tie my veil when I was young. Her hands shook as she held it out. She kept it not for hiding, but to remind me I was more than the words people used. Braddock swallowed hard, emotion hitting him like a blow. Talon accepted the cloth with a nod. She had courage, he said. She had hope, Liren whispered. Even when the world didn't give her much reason to. Talon folded the cloth gently and handed it back. Hope is strength. A thud hit the porch. All three of them jumped. Talon grabbed the door before Braddock could move, pressing his back against the wood and listening. The night outside had shifted. No longer quiet. Not empty either. Something was out there, breathing close, gravel crunching under a boot. Braddock reached for the rifle above the mantel. Liren stepped backward, fingers gripping the wall for balance. Talon signaled for silence. The footsteps moved across the porch, slow, deliberate, like someone circling a campfire before stepping into the light. Then the voice came, a rough voice. A mocking voice. A voice Talon recognized from earlier. Braddock Thorne, Flint Cade called. "Open this door." Braddock stiffened. Liren covered her mouth. Talon didn't move an inch. Flint's voice dropped lower. "You think one Apache can keep me from what's mine?" Talon's hand hovered near the knife at his belt. Flint's words burned, not because of the insult, but because of the claim behind it. He wasn't taunting Braddock. He was trying to provoke Talon into revealing himself, into stepping out where the others waited. Braddock whispered, "There could be 4 or 5. 10 of them out there." Talon nodded. Flint kicked the porch post. "Testing the house like a Wolf tests a fence." Then he said, "You open the door now, or we open it for you at first light." The footsteps faded. A whistle followed. Then hooves. "One horse, too?" Then silence again. Braddock exhaled shakily. "He didn't bring all his men." Talon frowned. "He came to see how afraid you are." "To smell the fear. He'll return with more before dawn." Liren pressed her hand against her chest, steadying her breath. "We can't wait until morning, then." Braddock hesitated. "What are you saying?" Liren looked between them. "If we stay here, this house becomes a trap. The Cades know every window and door. They grew up in this town. They know the land. They know the ridges. We don't." Talon nodded slowly. "She is right." Braddock's eyes widened. "Leave? At night, with riders roaming the hills." Talon stepped to the window and looked out into the dark ridgeline where shadows moved like silent ghosts. "It is dangerous," he said, "but staying is worse." Braddock rubbed his forehead. "If they catch us leaving, they'll take her right out of my hands." Liren stepped closer. "They won't catch us if we know where they're watching." Braddock stared at her. She had never spoken with this much fire before. Her voice usually trembled. Her steps were usually light, soft, hidden. But now, with danger at the door, something inside her rose like a storm, refusing to stay silent. Talon met her gaze. "What do you know, Liren?" She hesitated. Then she lifted her hand and pointed toward the ridge behind the house. "There is a hollow in the rocks. A place I used to hide when I was younger. Father never knew." "No one knew." Her voice softened. "Mother called it the Watcher's Gap. She used to take me there when the town grew loud with gossip." "What kind of place is it?" Talon asked. "A narrow path with thick brush," Liren explained. "Too narrow for riders. You can only cross it on foot. If we go through there, the Cades can't follow on horseback until they ride all the way around the ridge." Braddock blinked. "I didn't even know that place existed." Liren lowered her head. "I never told you. It was my escape. The only place I could breathe without eyes on me." Talon nodded slowly. "It will buy us time. Enough to reach the riverbank." Then his voice hardened. "But we must move soon, before Flint returns with more men." Braddock looked torn between fear and hope. "If we leave, we might never come back." "Home can be rebuilt," Talon said. "People cannot." Liren held her breath, waiting for her father's answer. Braddock finally nodded. "We leave before the moon hits the treetops." They moved quickly. Liren gathered a small bundle of clothes and her mother's cloth, tying it carefully. Braddock packed food and a map. Talon prepared the horses, but knew they'd abandoned them at the hollow. The animals snorted nervously, sensing danger in the air. Then, as Talon tightened the last strap, a soft voice came from the doorway. "Talon." He looked up. Liren stood there, veil glowing in the lantern light, hands pressed together in front of her. Her posture wasn't timid this time. She walked toward him with steady steps. "You could leave us," she said softly. "Right away now while no one is watching." Talon shook his head. "I do not leave people behind." She swallowed. "You barely know me." He stepped closer. "I know enough." Liren took a small breath. "When the veil comes off," she said, "will you regret staying?" Talon paused, feeling something heavy in her question. Something more than fear. Something like shame woven deep into her bones from years of being hidden. "No," he said. "I will not." She lowered her head slightly, but he saw the way her shoulders eased. A small release of tension she had carried too long. Braddock called from inside. "We're ready." Talon nodded and gestured toward the trees. It's time. They slipped into the night, sticking close to the shadows as they walked the path behind the house. The moon hung low, barely lighting the land. Every rustle of leaves sounded like boots. Every snap of a twig felt like danger. Liren led them toward the ridge. She moved with surprising certainty, guiding them through brush and stone until the land narrowed and opened into a dark passage between tall rocks. The Watchers' Gap, just as they stepped into it. Braddock grabbed Talon's arm and pointed back. A small flame flickered near the house, then another. Then three. Talon froze. The Cade brothers were lighting torches, and they were coming straight toward the house, silent as predators ready for a night ambush. Move, Talon said. Liren held her bundle tight. Braddock stared in fear at the glowing torches drawing closer. The narrow path ahead waited. But the hunters behind were moving faster than any of them had expected. The chase had begun. Talon guided them deeper into the narrow passage of Watcher's Gap, pushing branches aside as Liren and Braddock hurried behind him. The faint glow of the torches behind them flickered against the rocks, casting wild shadows that made the narrow canyon feel like it was tightening around them. Braddock's breath was rough. Liren's steps were quick and quiet, her veil brushing lightly against her cloak each time she turned to look behind. The path was rocky and uneven, stretching between tall walls that hid them from horseback riders but forced them onto foot. Talon kept his ears sharp for movement. He could hear distant shouts from the Cade men as they realized the house was empty. The chase had begun, but the gap was doing its job. The Cades couldn't follow on horses. They had to circle wide around the ridge, buying the small group precious time. By the time they reached the end of the narrow trail, sweat lined Braddock's face and Liren's hands trembled from gripping her bundle so tightly. The land opened onto a shallow slope leading to the river. The sky stretched wide above them, the stars sharp and bright. But behind them, somewhere beyond the rocks, voices echoed again, closer than before. They're pushing around the ridge faster than I thought, Talon said. Braddock wiped his brow. How many do you reckon? More than enough to cause trouble, Talon said. But we've gained enough distance. If we cross the river, their horses will slow on the bank. Liren lifted her head toward the sound of rushing water. There's a crossing point a short way down. Talon nodded. Lead the way. The river came into view, wide and shimmering under the moonlight. The water was cold and fast-moving, but shallow enough to cross with care. Talon stepped in first, holding out a hand for Liren. She hesitated a moment, then placed her hand in his, letting him guide her across the rocky bottom. Braddock followed behind, using his staff for balance. Halfway across, Liren stumbled on a smooth stone. Talon caught her quickly. She steadied, but her breath hitched as she clung to him. He felt the fear that had followed her for years, the fear of being chased, judged, claimed. When she found her footing again, she nodded for him to keep going. They reached the far bank, breathing hard but safe for the moment. Braddock bent down and touched the ground. The river will erase our tracks for a while? They'll have to guess where we crossed. Talon scanned the darkness. They'll keep looking, though. This won't end until we stand our ground somewhere new. Liren looked out over the trees that spread across the far side of the river. My mother always wanted to leave this valley, she said softly. She told me stories of places where no one cared about old contracts or marks on faces. Her voice softened. She said people there lived by kindness, not by fear. Braddock placed a hand on her shoulder. She would be proud of how far you've come tonight. Liren lowered her head. I just want to live free, without a veil, without hiding. Talon turned toward her and his voice stayed steady. You deserve that. Liren looked at him, the moonlight shining faintly through the veil, revealing the outline of her features. Then before we take another step, she said, I want to show you what others feared. Braddock opened his mouth to stop her, but Talon raised a hand. It's her choice. Liren reached up slowly and untied the veil, the thin cloth trembling between her fingers. The night breeze caught the edge of the fabric as she lifted it away. When it fell into her hands, her face was exposed to the open world. Talon looked at her without flinching, Her features were soft, her eyes wide with fear and hope all at once. A pale streak ran beneath her left eye, like a faded moonbrush mark across her skin. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a disfigurement. It was simply a unique mark she had been born with, something that made her different but not something that made her less. "You hid this?" Talon said quietly. Liren swallowed. "People stared. They talked. They said it meant something was wrong with me." Talon shook his head, his tone firm. "It means nothing except that it is part of you. No mark changes worth." Her breath left her in a shudder. The fear she had held for years loosened in her chest. She lowered the veil entirely. Letting the night air touch her skin freely, Braddock watched with tears gathering in his eyes. "She looks like her mother," he whispered. Talon nodded. "Strong and brave." Liren's eyes glistened. "Do you regret staying now that you've seen me?" Talon stepped closer. "No, I regret nothing." Just then, a distant crash echoed through the valley behind them. The Cades had reached the riverbank. Torches flared like angry fireflies across the dark water. Flint's voice boomed above the river's roar. "They crossed here." "Spread out." Braddock stiffened. "We can't outrun them forever." Talon turned toward the trees. "We won't have to. There's a cabin not far from here. An old outpost used by travelers. It has a strong door and high ground. We can hold them off until sunrise." Braddock nodded. "We'll follow your lead." They hurried into the woods, moving through thick brush and tangled roots. The distant hooves grew louder as the Cades tried to find a crossing point. But the forest was dense and the old outpost wasn't far. When they reached it, the cabin stood like a forgotten guardian, its logs weathered but sturdy. Talon pushed the door open and guided them inside. Braddock barred the door. Liren lit a lantern, her hand steadier than before. The small room glowed with warm light, and for the first time that night, they breathed without rushing. They sat for a moment in silence, catching their breath. Liren stood near the window, watching the forest for signs of movement. "Talon," she said quietly, "why did you stay? You could have walked away." He looked at her. "Because I've lived a long time watching people choose silence over courage. Tonight I chose the other path." Braddock cleared his throat. "You saved us." Talon shook his head. "You saved yourselves. I only stood beside you." Outside, the distant shouts of the Cade riders echoed, but they were fading. The forest was confusing them, scattering them. The river had slowed their search. The gap had shielded their escape. The old cabin's high ground made approaching unnoticed impossible. Hours passed slowly. At dawn, the sky began to lighten, warming the cabin walls. The shouts grew even more distant before fading completely. Flint had been forced to call off the search. They were safe. Braddock unbarred the door and stepped outside, breathing the cool morning air. Liren followed, sunlight touching her face without a veil for the first time in years. She blinked at the brightness, letting it warm her skin. Talon stood beside her. "This is your beginning," he said. Liren looked at him with a soft, steady gaze. "And I want you to be part of it." Braddock placed a hand on her back. "Wherever we go next, it will be a place where no one hunts us. No one tells us who you belong to. You belong to yourself." Liren nodded. "I want a life built on truth. Not old shadows?" Talon smiled gently. "Truth is stronger than fear." They walked down the slope together, leaving the cabin behind. Birds filled the morning with bright calls. The river shimmered. The trees swayed softly. The long night they had endured felt like a fading storm, the kind that leaves the land greener than before. Braddock turned to Talon. "If you choose to stay with us on this new path, you'd be welcome." "As family." Liren held her breath, waiting for his answer. Talon looked at them. At the father who had risked everything, at the young woman who had stepped into freedom with her face uncovered. And he nodded once. "I will stay," he said. "Not for duty. For home." Liren reached for his hand and he took it. Braddock smiled through tired eyes. They walked toward the rising sun. Together, leaving behind fear, old wounds, and the claims of men who believed they owned fate. Ahead of them lay a new beginning. built not on contracts or power but on courage, truth, and the simple belief that every person deserved to choose their own life. It was a good day for hope, and an even better day for a new story to begin.